Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Rifleman. Today we are not doing a shooting video, unfortunately. Once again, I am up at our camp in northern Maine, but I was working on preparations for making upcoming shooting videos, and I was going through some of my guns, and one thing that came to hand a few days ago as I was going through some of my other guns was my M1 Carbine, and I thought, there's a ton of information out there about the M1 Carbine. I don't want to go deep into the history of the carbine or the .30 carbine cartridge, but I wanted to take a bit of a look at this particular carbine. Its history, by the way, it is unloaded, nothing in the chamber, no magazine inserted. I'll lock the bolt back there. This particular carbine, what little I know of its history or how it came to be mine, because it was a little bit of a convoluted tale. This carbine's pretty much all original, meaning it's all original GI parts, with the exception of the rear sight, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I, as many people in my age group, lived through the third or fourth golden age of military surplus weapons. There was all kinds of stuff coming in from the former Eastern Bloc and even Western Europe, starting in the early 1990s and going up into the early 2000s. You could get all kinds of stuff super cheap. But one thing that always really fascinated me was the M1 Carbine. And the M1 Carbine was always, I started off very young with a very basic job. I didn't have a lot of disposable income. I could easily afford to buy a Mosin Nagant or an SKS or any of a number of other different Mausers and Enfields and things that were available at the time. But the M1 Carbine was always just a little bit out of my reach. These first hit the surplus market through the Director of Civilian Marksmanship in the early 1960s. And at that point, they were selling very cheap, I think $25 a piece. But by the early 1990s, when I got into collecting military firearms, they had already escalated. I think at about that time, you were probably looking at $600 or $700 for an M1 carbine. And I could buy 5 or 6 Mausers for the cost of an M1 carbine, and it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. As much as I wanted one, I didn't have the self-control to just not buy something else for a few months until I had saved up enough money for a carbine. And a lot of the carbines that were sold have been sold through originally the Director of Civilian Marksmanship, which is now transformed into the CMP, which is sort of a quasi-governmental, quasi-private enterprise organization that clears out U.S. small arms. As many of you may know, the M1 Carbine and the M1 Garand and a bunch of other U.S. military weapons have been sold off through the CMP to civilians. And the supplies of M1 carbines kind of dried up, I don't know, in the 1980s maybe, or the early 1990s, and there really weren't any carbines available through the CMP. But then sometime in the early 2000s, I think about 20 to 25 years ago, there was a batch of carbines that were returned from Uruguay. The United States government had sent weapons to countries all over the world, including Uruguay, under the auspices of the Lend-Lease program. Now, one of the provisions of the Lend-Lease program was that the country that took possession of these firearms would use them for as long as they needed them, but then when they were done, they would send them back to the United States. Uruguay apparently didn't really read the memo all that closely, because I guess in the early 2000s, someone from the federal government contacted the Uruguayan government and said, hey, we sent you a whole bunch of M1 carbines, which when you were done with them, you were supposed to send them back to us, and it doesn't look like you're using them anymore, so where are our carbines? And the Uruguayan government was like, oh, you were serious about that? And the U.S. was like, yes, we were serious about that. And they said, well, we have the carbines now, but yeah, we haven't been using them in a while. And we just kind of threw them all in a pile in a cave, a literal cave. I imagined something that had stalactites and stalagmites and was dripping water and everything, because the carbines that they had chucked into this cave were just absolutely dilapidated. The stocks were rotted off. They were covered in rust. They were incomplete. It was just a big pile of junk laying in an actual cave. But the U.S. government said, no, we would like those back. And the Uruguayans collected them all up and shipped them back to the United States, and the CMP ended up with them. But as I said, they were in deplorable condition. So the CMP, I guess there were a few that they managed to sell through their auction site that were in decent shape. But there was a ton of just what we refer to in the collector community as tomato steaks, barreled receivers that were just absolutely derelict. And the CMP said, hey, we're going to be blowing out these barreled receivers for, I think at the time, $125 a piece. So first come, first serve. All you're going to get is a barrel and a receiver. No bolt, no fire control group, no sights, no nothing. So I thought to myself, well, this is my opportunity. You know, if I want an M1 Carbine, this might be my one chance to actually get one. So, and I thought about maybe buying a few barreled receivers to see if one of them was considerably better than others. But I didn't have a lot of money at the moment, and so I sent off my $125 to the CMP. And I guess about, not long, 2, 3, 4 weeks later, I get a cardboard tube from FedEx, and it's got something rattling around inside it. And I remember opening the cardboard tube with some trepidation at home, and I took the one plug out of the end, and I think some bits of rust and dirt and things fell out, and I thought, ooh, what's this going to be? But actually, when I pulled the barreled receiver out of the tube and unwrapped it out of its paper, I was pleasantly surprised by a couple of things. It did have a front sight intact. This front sight, as a matter of fact. It did have a barrel band intact, and it was a late-style barrel band like this one. But it looked as though it had been run over by a truck or something. It was completely smashed flat. There was no rear sight. But one thing that I was very pleasantly surprised about was it did have a bolt in it. In fact, this bolt. But the reason that the bolt was included with the barreled receiver was that it was absolutely rusted in place. If you look closely at the bolt today, when I retract it slightly, you can see exactly where the rust line was, where it was frozen in place in the receiver. And that's what I got for my $125. So the first thing I had to do was get this bolt loosened up. And I mean, it was solid. It wouldn't move an inch. So I clamped this up in my bench vise in my basement, and I dripped some sort of penetrating oil, probably Croil, in around there, and I let it sit for 24 hours. And I tried moving the bolt, and it wouldn't move. And I started agitating the rust that I could see with a dental pick, and the bolt still wouldn't move. So I put some more Croil on it, and I let it sit for another 24 hours. And the next evening, I picked at it again, and the bolt still wouldn't move. But I didn't give up. I think it probably took me about at least a week of doing this. And then finally, one night when I went down there with my dental pick and started picking at the rust, I saw the bolt move ever so slightly. And that was all it took. Within about 3 or 4 minutes, I had the bolt out of the carbine. I assessed the damage. The pitting on the bolt, I don't think there's any pitting on the inside of the receiver. And the pitting on the bolt is very, very minimum. So I was able to completely disassemble the bolt, take out the firing pin, the extractor. I think the extractor spring was completely rotted away, so I had to replace that. So anyway, I had a barrel with a front sight, a smashed front barrel band, a bolt which appeared like it was operational, and that was it. So then I had to go about sourcing other stuff. I bought a reproduction stock originally. I think it was made by Boyd's. It was a black walnut stock. It was a bit oversized. I mean, it was workable, and it was made out of a beautiful piece of walnut, but it was it just didn't look right. I did use it for a couple of years, and then I sold it. So my dad, I think I've mentioned this in the past, my dad was kind of a U.S. military collector. He was heavily invested in M1 Garand rifles. He had a few carbines. He had a lot of spare parts. So he decided to help me out a little bit. He provided to me the operating rod, or I think on an M1 carbine, this is called the slide, and the recoil plate that goes on the back of the receiver. The receiver hooks into, it's attached to the stock. I think he maybe gave me this oiler bottle. I think that's the extent of what he gave me originally. So the front barrel band was smashed. Now this is an inland manufacturing. It's just a little bit over 500,000 serial number range. So that would be in the very first block that Inland made, which was about 1 million. It was the largest manufacturing block of all time. That ran from May of 42 till September of 43, I believe. So if we use the law of averages, it's very difficult to put an exact date on an M1 or an exact month on an M1 carbine, but this was probably made right around New Year's 1943 or Christmas 1942. So it would have had a very simple barrel band without a bayonet lug on it originally, but this is what was on it when I got it. So I decided to purchase a brand new Type 2 barrel band, I guess this is called, and I bought one from Fulton Armory. It was still wrapped in paper. So I managed to get the front sight off and get the old barrel band off. I think I actually still have that somewhere, all smashed flat. And I got this new barrel band on here. As I said, I had a reproduction stock, not this one at the time. I bought the front barrel band, or the barrel band. I guess there is no rear barrel band on these. I bought the barrel band from Fulton Armory. From Fulton Armory, I also got a brand new Winchester M2 trigger group. So this is the trigger group that was intended to go with the Select Fire M2 carbine. I think this was produced in the 1950s. It's not considered to be a full auto trigger group or anything like that. It will work with the selector and the lever and everything that goes with the M2, but these are perfectly legal to have in an M1 carbine. It does, of course, have the later rotating safety. The original M1 carbine, and what this would have had certainly when it was brand new, was a push button sort of side-to-side safety. Similar to what you'd find in a Ruger 1022 or a lot of pump-action shotguns, for instance. And then lastly, I needed a rear sight. And for whatever reason, nowadays, there's a lot of original rear sights available. But at the time, what Fulton Armory had was reproduction rear sights. And this is a pretty nice one. I thought it was made by Williams Gun Sight Company. But more recently, I think I've come to the conclusion that this was made by Ken Sight. It's a pretty nice sight. It's a very close approximation to the adjustable rear sight that came on later carbines. Of course, this one would have just had the very simple L-shaped flip-type rear sight with 2 apertures. But I decided to go with this because I wanted to be able to adjust the sights and shoot it. These are supposed to be staked in place. The fit was very, very loose. And I didn't end up staking this rear sight in place. I may replace it at some point in time. I actually used a Coke can or a beer can aluminum shim under there, which put it in there nice and tight. It's never moved. I've shot this carbine a bit. So basically, that's the story of my M1 carbine. From a Uruguayan cave to my hands. Now, the action's kind of a rattle trap. This carbine's been used a lot. Almost 100% of the original finish is going off of the receiver and the barrel. You can only barely see the roll marks. The inland manufacturing division of General Motors roll mark on the barrel here. This has been worn and worn and worn. I'm sure this was carried on guard duty for decades. And it, like I said, it's a bit of a rattle trap, but it shoots reliably. And the bore is just perfect. It's neat as a pin, shiny, bright. It's often the case with M1 carbines, even rattle trap carbines. The 30 carbine cartridge is not particularly high velocity, and it's not very erosive to bores, and it tends to leave, and it was never corrosive. There's never been, to my knowledge, any M1 carbine ammo that was ever issued that was corrosive. This is a Russian steel case. The U.S. actually did issue steel-cased ammo, although most of it was brass-cased. So the bore is beautiful. The carbine shoots accurately. We'll certainly be seeing this in the future on the channel. I generally use these 15-round Korean magazines with it, made by KCI. KCI is a South Korean manufacturer that actually produced magazines for the South Korean military. So we'll certainly be shooting this in the future. I just kind of wanted to tell the story of it, how I came to have it. Oh, and the reproduction stock that I had on it, I later sold, and my dad gave me this nice early high wood walnut stock, which is in very good condition. There's a couple of tiny little cracks, one right here behind the recoil plate, but overall it's in very, very good condition. I believe this was a Korean return, and for whatever reason they put it on a belt sander here and tried to sand off the cartouches, but there's still some remnants of the original cartouches on the stock. I actually came close to selling this carbine a few years ago, and then I came to my senses, and I think my position at the moment is I would never sell this. I just have too much invested in this carbine. Emotionally, not really so much money, but this was my first carbine. It's been my only carbine, I guess. I've had obviously the opportunity to shoot other carbines. My dad had quite a few at one point in time. But yeah, I would never get rid of this carbine. And we'll definitely be shooting it in the future. And when we do that, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys.